This video is focusing on Lesson 6 of Grammar, quotation marks, page 178 to 182, exercises 1 and 5.
Hello and welcome to Basic Punctuation. In this video, you'll learn how to use quotation marks. Quotation marks are a set of curly hooks that are often used to surround sentences or phrases which show a person's exact words. Here is an example. My dad said, "You can do it." As you can see, the quotation marks right here are around the exact words my dad said. Another example is, she said, "I will try my best." Again, here are the quotation marks around the words that she said. Did you notice that both these sentences have a comma right before the opening quotation marks? That's another use for the comma. Right before every direct quote, in other words, right before you write what someone says, you need to place a comma. It's a rule. That's because you are pausing before you tell what the person says. My dad said, "You can do it." She said, "I will try my best." What is interesting is that you can write both these sentences in another way. Pay attention to what happens to the punctuation. These sentences are still showing exactly what the people are saying. Only this time, they say it first, then we learn who says it. "You can do it," said my dad. "I will try my best," she said. What happened to the punctuation in both cases? Yes, they are somewhat reversed. The quotation marks are still around the part that is spoken. But notice where the comma is this time. Inside the quotations, right before the closing quotation marks. The comma is actually taking the place of the period. That's because the statement isn't finished yet. It actually ends here. Things change a little more when the sentence in quotations is a question or when it's exclamatory. Here is what I mean. "Do you think you can do it?" asked my dad. "I am trying my best," she answered. This time, rather than a comma within the quotations, it ends with a question mark because the dad is asking a question. And with an exclamation mark because she's exclaiming that she's trying really hard. Fun, isn't it? Quotation marks are indeed fun to work with. You can now have your characters speak when you write stories. Thanks for watching. Remember to keep practicing what you've learned with our fun games on Always Ice Cream and Clever Dragons.
Okay, and there's another video I'd like you to watch. Quotations and underlining titles. Really important, especially when applying it to essays and writing.
Hello, grammarians. Hello, Paige.
Hi, David.
So today we're going to be talking about quotation marks. What are they and what do they do, Paige Fitch?
We use quotation marks to indicate when someone is speaking, right? So if we're writing dialogue, we can say, "I like strawberry jam," said Lady Boffington.
So that's one use of quotation marks, which is to quote direct dialogue or to quote from a broader work. We can also use quotation marks for the titles of things. So, Paige, if you remember, you can use underlines or italics to indicate the title of something big, like a book of poetry or an album of songs or a movie or a television show.
Yeah.
So, Paige, for instance, one of my favorite albums is Gentle Giant's 1975 album, Free Hand.
Okay, but that's with italics or
It's with
underline.
italics or an underline in this case, since I'm writing it by hand. But track 2 on that record is called On Reflection.
Okay, so we put quotes around each individual song on the album.
Right. So this is the album, and this is a single song on it. Paige, let's say you and Jake wrote a book of bread poetry.
Okay, yes.
Right.
That is something I would do.
And he called it The Yeast I Can Do.
That is a great title.
Thank you. Right, so underline it to indicate that that's the full title. So this is the book. And then this book is made up of individual poems. So let's say you wrote a poem in the book called Why Do You Love Me? Sure, why not? So that's in quotes, and that indicates that this is a single work or a single poem.
Okay.
Also, let me know when that book is coming out, because I'll buy your book of poetry. So it's not just songs and poems, right? But it's also magazine and newspaper articles, TV episodes. Really, it's anything that is smaller than a larger work.
Right, it's something like inside of a larger thing, like a collection or
Right.
Yeah, an album.
So like if you were writing for a magazine or a newspaper, that newspaper's title, the Khan Academy Times, would be either italicized or underlined.
Mm-hmm.
But an article that you wrote for it, would be in quotes. I think that about does it for quotation marks, Paige.
Yeah, David?
Yeah.
I think I thought of a bread poetry book name.
Okay, what is it?
Loaves of Grass.
Yep, that's pretty good.
Okay.
All right, putting it in there. That's quotation marks. You can learn anything. David out.
Okay, so that was another video on quotations and underlining in titles. And this is the last one I'd like us to look at, which is looking at integrating quotations into formal writing.
Let's talk about the most effective ways to introduce or integrate quotations in academic writing. And the way you do that typically is with what's called a signal phrase. So a signal phrase, and a signal phrase is your own words that introduce the quotation, that gives them context, and that basically allow the reader to have a sense of what the quotation is about, who is speaking, what's in it, and the signal phrase then allows us to make sense of the quotation and integrates that passage smoothly into your own writing. So to give some examples here of different signal phrases, we've used this rather contentious opinion from a made-up source, Save the Pets by Gilbert Cates, and we're going to look at a number of patterns for how to quote from this passage. Our first pattern is what's called the short expression. And what this consists of is a subject, often the author you're quoting, and then we have a verb, and the verb is what's sometimes called a verb of expression. So these are verbs such as argues, or states, or insinuates, or implies, or suggests, verbs that show that the author is expressing some kind of opinion. And you can see that here we have write, there's our verb of expression. We also have Cates. Cates is our author who is doing the expressing. And that's really all we need in the simplest form for a short expression signal phrase. So after that, we're going to add our comma, and then we have the quotation. So our quotation here is a complete sentence. Complete sentence. As a result, it starts with a capital. And then at the very end, we're going to get rid of the final punctuation. Okay, so any final punctuation, such as a comma, a period, or a semicolon, we get rid of it, and we replace it with our own period at the very end after the citation. Notice also that we have a space between the quotation mark and the citation. And there's two little exceptions to what we've just talked about that you need to know. So if there's an exclamation mark in the quotation or a question mark, then you would keep that here as well. You would still add your final period too. And if you don't have a citation, then what you can do is you can just put your period inside the quotation marks. But that's fairly rare in academic writing because we do typically want to cite our sources. We're using obviously the MLA style guide here, but you can cite in other ways as well. So if you were to cite, let's say the Chicago Manual of Style and use a footnote, then probably you'd be using this pattern, and you can add your little 1 or whatever footnote number you're at after the quotation. Now notice that your short expression doesn't have to be that short. So if you look at the next example here, we have at the core still our subject, and we have our verb of expression, but we have lots of other information as well before we get to our comma and our quotation. Okay, so you're not restricted to just this really short introductory phrase, but you can elaborate on the pattern a little bit. Finally, notice the use of as in this pattern. Often people will start with as so-and-so argues. So that's a common way to introduce a quotation. The second pattern we'll have a look at here is what's called the formal introduction. And as the name implies, this is a signal phrase that has a little bit more weight to it. So it's a signal phrase that's often longer. It doesn't have to have that verb of expression in it, but it's a kind of statement. It often summarizes the quotation which follows afterwards. So you can see here that we have said there is one question PETA supporters often face, and then the quotation is that exact question. Similarly, in the second example, some critics believe that PETA is inconsistent in its use of Darwinian principles. You can see we have this fairly elaborate, complete sentence. The sentence tries to summarize something about what the quotation is saying, and it introduces the quotation that way. Okay, so the key then to our signal phrase is that we have a complete sentence. We don't just have a short tag that has a verb of expression in it, but we have a nice complete sentence, and then we have a colon, which carries a bit more weight than a comma, and then we're going to get our quotation. Now notice again that our quotation is also a complete sentence in this pattern, and because of that, because in the original we started with, or we had a lowercase I, we've used square brackets to make this into an uppercase I, and you're definitely allowed to do that. So we have our complete sentence, then we have our citation, and we have a period. Notice that in the second example, we often use formal introductions with a block quotation. So a block quote is a passage of 4 or more lines of text, and a block quote is fairly long, and if you're going to use a longer quotation, then it better be important, right? You don't want to waste the reader's time by quoting long stretches of text without it having anything to do with your argument. But because the quotation is quite long, the reader is also going to struggle a bit with the contents of the quotation unless you kind of summarize what's coming up. And that's why with block quotations, we typically want to use a formal introduction to really give a good sense of what's being said here. Our third type of signal phrase is the running quotation, and this is our last major pattern as well. A running quotation is where your signal phrase runs directly into the quote with no intervening punctuation. Okay, so there's no comma, no colon in between, and instead your signal phrase and the quote form one complete sentence. So if you were to take the quotation marks off, if you got rid of them, you should be able to read all of this as one complete sentence. And notice that's why we have the lowercase t here. This used to be a capital T, but we've used square brackets to turn into a lowercase t in this case. Incidentally, you don't want to use square brackets too often, so sometimes you may want to use a different kind of introduction just so you can avoid the use of square brackets. If you look at the last example here, you'll notice that one thing you can do with this kind of quotation is you can continue after the quote. Typically, when we quote a passage, we just want to put a period behind it. We don't want to keep going, but if you want to experiment, if you're more adventurous, and if your quotation is fairly short, then you can keep your sentence going sometimes afterwards. But try to do that just with this kind of pattern, mostly. And really check, if you were to take the quotation marks off, that all of this can still be one complete sentence. Let's end with a few minor variants that we haven't covered yet. So these are more exceptional kinds of signal phrases. So I would tend to stick with the major patterns that we've talked about, but occasionally you may want to experiment a bit and try out these variants. One thing you can do is you can add an extra quote or two after your first one. So if you look at this one, it says the death of human beings, and then we have some of our own words, and we have a second quotation afterwards. If they're from the same page, then you would just put one page number after the last one. If they're from different pages, then you would have to add a separate citation after this one. So let's say this was from page 98. You would put the citation right after the final quotation marks there. Okay, so that's one thing you can do. You can add an extra quote afterwards, but be very careful. Try to do this only with shorter quotations and make sure that they are nicely integrated, that the syntax of your sentence keeps things going smoothly. Two final ones here. You can delay the signal phrase, and you can do that either by sticking it in the middle, or you can stick it at the very end. So we'll call this an inverted signal phrase, and then the last one is a delayed signal phrase. I would be hesitant to do this too often, especially in academic writing, because as soon as you delay your signal phrase, what happens is that the reader doesn't quite know what to make of the quotation until they get to that signal phrase. And any kind of delay makes it harder for the reader. So if you're okay with that, if you like to keep your reader in suspense a bit, that's fine. But if you really want to help your reader out, it's usually best to put your signal phrase at the beginning. This type of signal phrase, an inverted or delayed signal phrase, is probably more common in formats like newspapers. Okay, but in academic writing, I would tend to stay away from it. So that's it for signal phrases. Try them out yourself. Try to vary your writing a little bit. And I think if you do that, you'll be able to write more freely, and you'll be able to introduce your quotations in a way that's smooth and coherent.
Okay, so that has provided you with a lot of detailed examples of how to do quotations. Lesson 6 answers. Number 1, the fifth estate should be underlined. Number 2, quotations around I don't explain, said Marshall McLuhan. Quotations around I explore. Number 3, quotations around do I have to do all of the dishes by myself? End quote, my roommate asked. Number 4, wag the dog, underlined. Number 5, the importance of being earnest should be in quotations. The picture of Dorian Gray is underlined. The Ballad of Reading Gaul is quotations, and Selfish Giant is underlined. Number 6, quotations. Never use a big word if a little one will do. Number 7, quotations around. The class period can't be over, end quote, said the student. Quote, I haven't even started my concluding paragraph yet, end quote. Number 8, flair should be underlined. Number 9, thinking as a hobby should be in quotations. And number 10, sorry, hard to see. The English patient should be underlined. Exercise number 5 for lesson 6. Number 1, there are no corrections. Number 2, quote, we know what a person thinks, not when he tells us what he thinks, end quote, said Isaac Bashevis Singer. Quote, but by his actions, end quote. The Spanish proverb, quote, el pez muere por la boca, end quote, translated means, quote, the fish dies because it opens its mouth, end quote. Number 4, quote, ask yourself whether you are happy and you cease to be so, end quote, John Stuart Mill wrote. Number 5, a Russian proverb states, quote, without a shepherd, sheep are not a flock, end quote. Number 6, Stephen Leacock felt that, quote, the essence of humor is human kindliness, end quote. Number 7, St. Jerome had the following insight, quote, the friendship that can cease has never been real, quote. Oscar Wilde found that, quote, in his world there are only two tragedies. One is not, sorry, it's hard for me to see. One is not getting what one wants, the other is getting it, end quote. Number 9, quote, self-respect, end quote, observed Joe Clark, quote, permeates every aspect of your life, end quote. Number 10, quote, choose a job you love, quote, Confucius suggested, quote, and you will never have to work a day in your life, end quote. And those are the answers for the last lesson.